it's good that laws are established. Because if laws are never established, then behaviors will never change. Then people will know their boundaries. And if people don't know their boundaries, then they're going to act in a way that will harm themselves and other people. Nahum chapter 1, verse 3, it says, the Lord is slow to anger and great in power, and the Lord will by no means clear the guilty. His way is in whirlwind and storm, and the clouds are the dust of his feet. Now, Nahum quotes Exodus 34, verse 7, where this is the first time God describes himself in the Bible. And the first thing he says is that he is gracious, compassionate, slow to anger. And that's something quoted throughout the prophets. Later, something Jonah quotes, which is why Jonah knew that God was going to spare Nineveh. But then notice he doesn't start with the attribute of just gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, or his mercy. He also says he will not leave the guilty unpunished. So God, in other words, even God himself, when he defined himself, he connects his compassion and mercy with his justice. They're all interconnected. Do you see that? Ever since Exodus 34:7, he doesn't highlight one attribute at the expense of another. He brings up both. Yes, I am compassionate and mercy, but I also don't let the guilty go unpunished. I'm just. I'm going to make sure everyone gets what they are accountable for or deserve. You see, justice is a way to understand God's mercy and compassion. Here's what I mean. I think we have a hard time dealing with God's jealousy, anger, and wrath. I think some of us, especially in America, we have a hard time with it because we haven't really been victims of injustice. Because here's why I say that. If you've truly been a victim of injustice, you would want God to judge certain people or groups of people at some point, wouldn't you? You know, one of the reasons they talked about the victims of the Holocaust or even the slaves, the thing that got them through the trials, they all had the strong faith God will judge you one day, even if the system won't judge you. Because think about it. If people can get away with things, can we all agree that we don't live in a just world? If people get away with things and people go, right? If this was all there was to life, what would keep you going at some point? Wouldn't you be in despair? What if someone murdered your family in front of you and they just got off scot-free? You could just be like, oh, well, God is love. He's got to forgive. No, you would actually say God is unloving if he doesn't do something about that. You see, it doesn't matter if the person loves you or not. A judge must uphold justice or else they're no longer a judge. You see, we all want justice when we're victims of injustice, but we all want to uphold mercy and grace and love when we are not the victims of injustice. Do you see that? Do you see how arbitrary we make things? We get mad at God for not forgiving and showing compassion when we're the suspects. But you wouldn't be saying the same thing if you're the victim. You wouldn't say, God, just forgive the person that murdered our family or murdered our country or killed our village. You see, God's anger, jealousy, and wrath has to exist in order to uphold his love and his integrity. Just like any other judge who just says, I'm going to forgive everybody, we will say that judge is not a judge anymore. We would vote him out. So why would God be any different? If he's a perfect judge, how can he just let guilty people go unpunished? In fact, letting guilty people go unpunished would compromise his standard of love and mercy. This is the way the Apostle Paul said it in Romans chapter 12, verse 9. He quotes God by saying that vengeance is mine and I will repay. And when he's talking about vengeance, it's not talking about just God is this mafia boss who just has anger and he wants to kill people. It's the idea of justice. And so what Paul is saying is that even if you are a victim of injustice or bad things have happened to you and people have gone unpunished, don't take justice into your own hands. Let God handle that person. It might not happen in this life, but in the life to come, one day, every person will have to face the judge. Every person will have to face the judge. And God will not leave the guilty unpunished. Whether you're the suspect or you're the victim, everybody will be accounted for. Look at Romans 3:20. I'm going to camp on Romans for a little bit to kind of show you how this all comes together. Romans 3:20. So I showed you the Old Testament, and now let's look at New Testament. God's standard of jealousy, wrath, and anger stays the same. For by works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. So here, Paul is saying that through God's law, people become aware of sin. And then he later adds this in Romans 4:15. For the law brings wrath, but where there is no law, there is no transgression. So we get an idea of what is God's wrath. Again, God's wrath is not just arbitrarily he's being emotional. His wrath comes from what, according to Paul? His law. And when people transgress or break this law, he responds with wrath. So wrath is really justice. Do you see that? We have to redefine wrath in our head. Wrath, when you're reading about God's wrath, it's justice. He's not bringing wrath unfairly to anybody. He brings wrath to those who deserve wrath based on his law and how much they've transgressed his law. Let's continue on. Romans 7, verse 7. So what was the point of the law then? What then shall we say? That the law is sin? By no means. Yet if it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin. For I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said you shall not covet. So here's what Paul's trying to put together with all these verses. He uses the word transgression. Now, you guys know what the word transgression means. It means to cross a boundary, right? So you cannot transgress something if you don't know the boundary, or if there's no boundary at all. So let's say if God had no sense of justice whatsoever, he didn't care, then there's no such thing as transgression. Does that make sense? So here's the analogy. If there is no speed limit on George Bush like it is in the Autobahn, can you ever get a ticket for how fast no, you can't. You should not get a ticket. No matter, even if you're going 500 miles per hour, there's no boundary or speed limit. You're not transgressing anything. But the minute they put a law in place and say the speed limit is 70, even 71, even 75, even, right? Now you are a transgressor. So what was the point of putting up a sign of 70? The point of putting up a law is to change the behavior of the people, because there is trying to show the people that if your behavior doesn't change, this behavior will be very dangerous for you and other people. When God gives a law, what he's trying to do, he's trying to show you the boundaries of his holiness. And he's saying, if you keep crossing this boundary, not only is it bad for other people, it's going to be bad for you. And because you're crossing this boundary, I have to keep you accountable to this standard. It's good that laws are established, because if laws are never established, then behaviors will never change. Then people will know their boundaries. And if people don't know their boundaries, then they're going to act in a way that will harm themselves and other people. Paul is making the same point. He is saying the reason why God establishes his law is to show you his standard of justice. He's trying to show you his boundaries. And by reacting with anger and wrath towards his law, he's trying to show you your behavior, you need to change according to this law, because if you don't, if you remain a transgressor, I'm going to bring wrath, because right now you are harming other people. So God's wrath is necessary for justice and his love. Because can you imagine living in a lawless society? What if there's no courts? What if there's no cops? You think we'll be a more loving society? Love is upheld by what? Justice. And justice is upheld by what? Wrath. So wrath is the punishment to uphold God's law or justice. What if our court said, hey, you're guilty of killing somebody, but we don't have any punishment for that? Would that change? Would that help people at all? Oh, bad you murdered the 20th person. What's the punishment? We don't do punishment here. We don't do wrath. We don't do jail. We don't believe in capital punishment. We don't do anything. Right? So God, he can't just show his law and his standard of justice. He has to have wrath to make people accountable to the law.